Hello, good day. So we are about to report for the Peter Singer's Practical Ethics Chapter 9 about climate change. This is R17 module of Ethics 1. So the first part, Peter Singer starts this part with an analogy. Imagine a village where everyone puts their waste down a giant drain, leaving it unnoticed. The capacity of the drain to dispose of waste has seemed limitless. If we continue to produce more waste, our right to object to waste disposal becomes questionable. Our atmosphere as a giant brain is already using our gases beyond its capacity. Current trends suggest that we will reach 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide by 2040. Allowing levels of carbon dioxide to reach 450 ppm is already taking a grave risk. Global warming has repeatedly exceeded predictions, and feedback loops in planetary warming are becoming more dangerous. The melting of the Arctic ice is a symptom of global warming and a cause for further warming. Those are the points that Peter Singer wrote in that part. He stated that humanity as a whole must reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by at most 350 ppm, as he noted from Jim Hansen, a NASA researcher. He states an analogy that everyone in this planet is living in a village in which the waste that go down the giant dune are being left unnoticed. For the continuing to leave our waste unchecked will reach a critical level of 450 ppm of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by 2040. If the average temperature reaches an increase by 2%, dangerous and large-scale consequences are apparent. He stated that we are already using our atmosphere beyond its capacity. For the next part, it talks about historical responsibility and what is an equitable distribution. Singer noted here that the Brazilian government proposed that emission reduction targets should be set according to the impact of our nation's historic emissions on temperature rise. It concluded that the United States is responsible for 20% of 20% of the temperature rise. European emissions are responsible for the 14%. Latin America also comes out contributing 14%, and all of East Asia, including China, has contributed only 10%, and South Asia, including India, only 7%. China suggested that historic contributions to climate change should be considered on a per capita basis. Carbon equity, a report prepared by five Chinese academic and policy-oriented think tanks for the 2009 conference on climate change, argues that the fact that China has a much larger population than the US has to be taken into account in apportioning responsibility for the greenhouse problem. The report calculates that over the period of 1850 to 2004, the average American has been responsible for putting 21 times as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as the average Chinese and 53 times as much as the average than the average Indian. On average, the Britons and Canadians are responsible for 16 times as much carbon being in the atmosphere as Chinese and 14 times as much as the Indians. The principle of historical responsibility thus indicates that almost all sacrifices required to stop global warming should be made by the older industrialized civilizations or nations. With the studies noted, Peter Singer that even if we accept the argument that you fix it today, applies only from the time when the biggest emitters knew that their emissions were risking dangerous atmospheric climate change. It will be the case that the United States and the industrialized nations of Europe ought to be doing much more than any other nation to solve the problem.
The next section of the chapter is known as the equal shares. At a 2009 United Nations Summit meeting on climate change, the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, pointed out that climate change will probably have a more severe impact on Africa than on any other part of the world. And yet, Africa has fewer resources to draw on to meet this challenge. Many models of the changes that global warming is likely to bring show that precipitation will decrease nearer the equator and increase nearer the poles. The rainfall on which hundreds of millions rely to grow their food will become less reliable. Moreover, the poor nations depend on agriculture far more than the rich. It is also obviously true that the poorer nations lack the resources to adapt. Other countries cannot afford such expensive ways of providing water and controlling flooding from rising sea levels. Next slide, please. President Kagame proposed that every human being is entitled to an equal share of the atmosphere. The equal shares is a time-slice principle. It takes no account of the past and gives everyone an equal share of the atmosphere from now on. When applied in practice, it could aim to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions at a level that will prevent us from exceeding 450 ppm of carbon dioxide. It is controversial how much carbon we could emit per person while remaining below that level, but one plausible figure is 2 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year. Next slide, please. However, it is of course not possible for industrialized nations like Germany and the United States to make such dramatic reductions in the short term, or at least not without devastating economic consequences that would be likely in a democracy to lead to a change of the government and a reversal of the policy. This makes the principle of equal per capita shares an unrealistic idea. However, there are two mitigating factors to consider. The first is that making greenhouse gas emissions quotas tradable would ease the transition to a low emissions economy. Emissions trading works on the simple economic principle that if you can buy something more cheaply than you can produce it yourself, you're better off buying it than producing it. Next slide, please. The second factor is that the reductions do not need to be made all at once. The German Advisory Council on Global Change suggested that the total amount of permissible emissions of carbon dioxide should not be calculated for a single year, but rather should be set for the entire period between now and 2050. Countries could then produce their own roadmaps showing how they would reduce their carbon dioxide emissions so as not to exceed their carbon budgets before 2015. Although the German proposal gives industrialized countries time to make changes, for those countries with the highest current per capita emissions outputs, the time is very short. Luxury versus subsistence. In 1993, the philosopher Henry Shue argued that a just allocation of quotas to emit greenhouse gases would distinguish between subsistence emissions and luxury emissions, so that methane from rice paddies in poor countries would not rank equally with emissions from large vehicles used for recreational driving in the rich nations. Emission of subsistence and development emissions of poor countries should be accommodated by any future agreements, whereas the luxury emissions of rich countries should be restricted. Next slide, please. The distinction between subsistence emissions and luxury emissions is of only limited use to China. However, because there are already more Chinese living an affluent lifestyle and therefore responsible for a high level of emissions. Admittedly, almost all Germans are responsible for a high level of emissions, whereas only a small proportion of Chinese are. But if China is calling on rich countries to restrict their luxury emissions, it can scarcely ignore the luxury emissions coming from its own elite. Further discussion of the section of chapter 9 would be discussed by Venmar.
So, good day, sir. I am Velmar here. I'll talk about form of aggressions. So, notable line in this topic is the impact of emissions on vulnerable regions, likening it to a devastating form of war. Next slide, please. So, cost of greenhouse gases. It explores three principles for distributing resources and argues that rich nations cannot justify their high greenhouse gas emissions under any of these principles, which we can conclude that they are doing something wrong. Next is in 2007, President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda said as greenhouse gases happens, um, Alaska and Siberia could become good for agriculture. However, how about Africa? Recently, we can already see the effects brought by these greenhouse gases by the rich countries, which affects Africa greatly in terms of their economy and health of its people. Next, in the last statement, their actions may be even more devastating than conventional forms of war. By aggression, we could imagine troops moving across border or planes bombing enemy position. However, in emitting high levels of greenhouse gases, the rich nations are not deliberately attacking another country, but it leads to the effects of greenhouse gases to the much poorer country. So next slide, please. The effects of greenhouse gases. Land that grow crops will become barren. Glaciers that for millennia have fed rivers will dwindle. The sea will take over fertile fields. Tropical disease will spread, and people will starve or become refugees. I highlighted this last statement to emphasize that all of these effects will come back to us, the one who caused these. Next slide, please. So, doctrine or double effect. Knowingly causing harm can be justified if the harm is not intended. The goal is sufficiently important to outweigh the harm caused, and there is no other way of achieving the goal without causing at least as great harm. Next slide. So, in the terms of global warming, the harm caused far outweighs the good obtained. In this case, the reverse of this is the same as the doctrine. Next, President George W. Bush said that we will not do anything that harms our economy because first things first are the people who live in America. R.A. Fleischer, his spokesperson, said also that the president will not agree to instruct drivers to sharply reduce their consumption since it's an American way of life. Can infer from this that the United States was bringing life-threatening harm to hundreds of millions of people, or rather than billions of people, because its leader put a higher priority on preserving its citizens' economic interests and their right to burn as much fuel as they wish, than on the survival of people outside the United States. Next slide. So we are culpable for the harm we are doing to them. What we are doing to the people most at risk from global warming. Therefore, it is similar in its impact to waging aggressive war on them. It differs in its motivation, but that will be little consolation to them. Moreover, because we know what we are doing and yet do not stop doing it, we cannot shirk responsibility for it. We are culpable for the harm we are doing to them. Next slide. So, taking a shortcut across a beautiful lawn. We often find ourselves faced with actions that seem to be wrong, even though it isn't obvious that they will have bad consequences. We can relate this to taking a shortcut across a beautiful lawn, which is a principle by the philosophers. We have three cases here. The first is, what difference will it make if I take the shortcut just once? In this case, the grass will not have perceptible damage from one person walking on it. However, what if everyone did that? The take in here is that because it would be bad if everyone were to do it, it must be wrong for me to do it. Next case is, what if it is late at night and no one else is around? Is it wrong because my imprint on the grass will make a causal contribution, even if only a small one, to the grass wearing out? Next case is, what if I study the amount of traffic the lawn can bear? Is it still wrong if I do it fewer than the limit and I do it when no one is looking, and so do not influence others to cross it? In the second and third example is a different case for both consequentialists and non-consequentialists. An act utilitarian would judge every act in accordance with its consequences, would say that if you could really be sure that walking across the grass would have no harmful consequences at all, you will not be wrong to do it. A rule utilitarian could say that because the best rule for everyone to observe in these circumstances would be do not cross the lawn, it would be wrong for me to cross it, even if my crossing would have no bad consequences. Lastly, a Kantian too could reject lawn crossing because Kant said that if I cannot will the maxim of my action to be a universal law, then it must be wrong. So basically, the take is different on the different situations or which values are you taking or siding with. However, on the next topic in ideal code or real world, Brad Hooker argues for a version of real utilitarianism that provides a barrier against making rules too complicated. He holds that we act wrongly if we act contrary to a rule that would be part of the set of rules that, if internalized by the overwhelming majority of people, would have the best consequences. He said if we make rules too specific, people will find them too difficult to internalize or act on. Lastly, the code must be publicly known and promoted. He stated that it is hard to imagine that a rule like cross the lawn only when you can do it in secret could be part of the best moral code. For then everyone would know that secret lawn crossing were permitted and too many people would cross the lawn at night. Next slide. The complicity principle. Mr. Christopher Goods examined these issues in this book, Complicity, Ethics, and Law for a Collective Age. Uh, the The complicity principle proposed by Christopher Kuss holds individuals accountable when intentionally participating in harmful actions committed by others. He said that if the principle is not consequentialist because it makes him accountable independently of the actual difference he make. He said that I am accountable for what others do when I intentionally participate in the wrong they do or the harm they cause. He includes the emission of chlorofluorocarbons or CFCs, the gases that damage the ozone layer, like the ozone hole, as an example of complicity. In the individual emissions from many nations were damaging the atmosphere. The ozone was damaged by gases from appliances like ref and aircon, which in the 1987 Montreal Protocol was freed to stop the use of such gases to phase out CFCs. Next slide. If we collectively cause harm, then even though we do not deliberately set out to do something together, and the contribution of a single individual will make no difference to the harm done. We must realize the damage is much more serious than ruining a law. Next. A vivid illustration of how ignoring imperceptible harms can lead us astray. It shows the absurd ano, Jonathan Glover offers a vivid illustration of how ignoring imperceptible harms can lead us astray. Glover imagines that 100 hungry bandits swoop down to the lunch of 100 people containing a bowl of beans. However, a bandit suggested take one bean per person. In this case, the bandits can all sleep well knowing that none of them has harmed anyone. This can be related to acting together with a billion other affluent people. We each emit 20 tons of carbon dioxide. Each of us makes only an imperceptible difference to the climate and so inflicts only an perceptible harm on anyone. Next. So the cap and trade scheme. Individual reductions in carbon emissions may have no effect on reducing emissions. The savings in emissions caused by my change of lifestyle will not have resulted in fewer emissions overall, 2 times of carbon dioxide per person per year. In relation to this, James Hansen pointed out if the government adopts a cap and trade scheme for reducing carbon emissions, individual reduction in carbon emissions may have no effect on reducing emissions. Basically, a cap and trade scheme is a market-based approach to controlling pollution, particularly greenhouse gas emissions. The scheme sets an overall limit or cap on the total amount of certain pollutants that can be emitted by regulated entities such as companies or industries. Next. So cattle and sheep problem. They emit high levels of methane and which livestock contributes more to global warming and all front of transport combined. For non-consequentialists, the complicity principle is relevant here. If the government's emission trading scheme does not cut greenhouse gas emissions to a point which there is no further danger of serious damage to the planet's climates, that time no country has implemented a scheme that will cut greenhouse gases sufficiently to eliminate such risk. Next. To continue to emit greenhouse gases even at a level consistent with the government scheme, still to participate in a wrongful practice that will harm others. A non-consequentialist could therefore hold that our international participation in this practice is wrong, even if cutting one's own emission to zero would have no impact on the total amount of greenhouse gases put into the atmosphere. And last slide. So the possible solutions. By putting a price on carbon emissions, we create an incentive for finding new ways to discover cost-effective, low-emission forms of energy that will replace the use of fossil fuels simply because they are cheaper. We can also urge governments to fund research and development in such forms of energy. The emissions from cattle and sheep should be taxed or brought within the scope of a carbon trading scheme. Lastly, education should be given and access to everyone. And that's all for my report. Thank you so much.